Well, so now we're shifting gears. We're traveling a little bit north and west from Iraq. If you have a picture in your mind's eye, you could go from Mesopotamia in Iraq between the waters to the west. You'd land at a port city. It could be Beirut. It could be Tyre or Sidon or Haifa, Jaffa, any of those. And you get on a boat and you go north, you go past Istanbul and you land at just west of the transition from Europe to Asia. It's called the Hellespont, that little peninsula sticking out. And there you'd find a city where the port closes on Shabbat. The major shipping houses are all owned by Jews. All the porters, all the longshoremen who unload the ships, all the warehouse workers are Jews. So are many of the fishermen, the tobacco workers, even the beggars are mostly Jews. In fact, the largest single ethnic group in this city on the Mediterranean are Jews. It's not Haifa, it's Salonika. The Jews are speaking a Romance language there. It's a medieval version of Spanish that's called Ladino or Judesmo. We'll talk about it in a moment. But it's a city that no longer exists. If you look on a map, you will not find Salonika. You will find Thessaloniki. And that name change hides quite a bit. You know, what you call a city makes a big difference. Is it Jerusalem? Is it Al-Quds, to use the Arabic term? Again, reflects politics as much as history. Same too with Salonika and the transition to Thessaloniki. Now, that language they spoke is sometimes called Ladino, but technically Ladino is the elevated intellectual version, which you might hear a learned discourse in, or a lecture or poetry written in, or certainly the written form. The daily life version of what they spoke was called Judesmo. And it was like Yiddish. It was a medieval language converted into Hebrew letters with some Hebrew idioms included. So just as Yiddish was Middle German translated into Hebrew letters with some Slavic and other words, so too Ladino was medieval Spanish with a few Hebrew words mixed in. And that culture that they followed in this city and among the people who were part of Jewish Salonika was predominantly called Sephardic. And that goes back to the word Sepharad applied to Spain. Now, the word Sepharad actually appears in the Bible, but it's not really clear what it's referring to. Sepharad was a land way, way out west, just like Ashkenaz was a land way, way up north. But the Bible wasn't too specific. So when later generations of Jews were looking for names for these places they'd moved to, the ones that went north called it Ashkenaz, the ones that went west called it Sepharad, and that's where Ashkenazi and Sephardi come from. And so these Sephardic Jews claimed a root back in Spain, or at least the Spanish Iberian Peninsula, because some went from Spain to Portugal and then from Portugal into their own diaspora. And they had those roots in Spain, even if they wound up elsewhere in the Mediterranean, as we'll see in a map in just a moment. And so let me pull up our Jews of Salonika slideshow. And here you see on the right a picture of Jews in Salonika that's colorized, obviously. They didn't have color photography back then, but you'll notice the bright colors, the headdresses, the fez, again, reflecting an Ottoman political sensibility, and the style of dancing even has a kind of Mediterranean, Middle Eastern flavor to it. So here's a map that describes the migration of Sephardic Jews when they left Spain. You'll notice many of them went to Lisbon, went to Portugal first, and then from Portugal went to other places, including towards America. That's that Spanish and Portuguese synagogue, or New Amsterdam, or Dutch colonies in South America. You'll notice some of them went into Northern Europe, into places like La Rochelle, Paris, into Amsterdam and the Netherlands, into Hamburg and into London. And large numbers earlier in the period made their way into Morocco, Algeria, Tunisia, into Italy, into Venice, and into the Ottoman Empire more broadly further east, into Egypt, the land of Israel. Some wound up in Jerusalem, and some wound up in Asia Minor. So you have some in Greece, in Crete, in Western Turkey, in Izmir most famously, in Constantinople, the capital, and into Salonika, Thessaloniki, and up into the Balkans as well, Belgrade. There were Bosnian Sephardic Jews and Croatian Sephardic Jews, all the way up even into Hungary and Vienna and Krakow. So they had a quite wide-ranging migration, but you'll notice the black lines are happening a bit later, and the red lines are happening a bit earlier. So from the 14th to the 17th century, so that's from the from say from the 15th to the 17th. So that's from the 1400s through the 1600s. They wound up landing to some extent in Italy, but to a large extent in the Ottoman Empire and in Arab countries more broadly. Whereas those later migrations were often Jews who had converted to Christianity in an outward form. They were what were called conversos, and who gradually made their way out in some way, whether it was into Christian Europe, which they could get into because they were nominally Christian. The UK, by the way, the United Kingdom had not allowed Jews in after, I think, 1290, and the only Jews allowed in were these conversos who were secretly Jewish, and they weren't able to come out as Jewish until much later in European history. They had about 100 years of hidden Jewishness in the UK before they were able to come out of the closet. Many of those who did go from hidden Jewish status into Amsterdam were able to come out of the closet right away. The family of Baruch Spinoza was just one example. And some of the ones who wound up going to America came out and then wound up in trouble because they were reconquered by the Portuguese. They were a Dutch colony that was then reconquered by the Portuguese, and they had admitted they were lying about being Christian, and they had to flee. Actually, the first group of Jews that landed in America came to New Amsterdam, who had to flee the Dutch colony of Recife because it was conquered by the Portuguese, and the Inquisition shortly followed. So this Sephardic dispersion, this diaspora, spreads across the Mediterranean, and often they bring with them their Spanish identity. So in Salonika, they named synagogues, things like the Aragon Synagogue, the Catalan Synagogue, the Otranto Synagogue, the Lisbon Synagogue, and then the New Lisbon Synagogue when there was an argument within the Old Lisbon Synagogue and they made a split between the congregations. Again, what else is new? Personal names also could have names like Navarro and Algava, and those were family names among these people because, again, their roots were in this Spanish language mediated through Jewish alphabets. They even used foods that they had eaten way back when in Spain. They brought with them in their new settlements, particularly to Salonica, because they had such a strong population base there, which we'll see in just a minute. So I want to play for you a piece of music that is an ancient Sephardic melody. We'll hear some more modern ones a little bit later. And this is called Quando el Rey Nimrod. It recalls a myth that the king Nimrod saw a star in the sky and decided he wanted to stop the birth of the person who would redeem the Jews, Abraham, our father. So you can hear, as you'll see the lyrics, the echo of Christian influence, even in this very Jewish song about Abraham. So here is a version of Quando el Rey Nimrod. So you see there the influence of that outside culture. You hear the Spanish. If you study Spanish, you could make sense of a lot of that. You see the mixing of the Hebrew and the English. So Avram Avinu, Abraham our father, Padre querido, beloved father, Luz de Israel, the light of Israel, but some words stay the same. So that's the flavor of Ladino culture in a short overview. Now, to get specifically into the town of Salonika, its first settlement was actually a few centuries before the year 0. It was named after a sister of Alexander the Great. So it actually began as Thessaloniki. It was conquered by the Ottoman Turks in 1430, part of their gradual invasion of Europe. In fact, if we go back to that map we saw earlier, you'll see where Turkish territory was based and expanded. You see that yellow there, the Ottoman Empire at its peak in the 17th century. Well, they had conquered Thessaloniki as early as 1430. They managed to make their way up. They were at the gates of Vienna in the early 1600s and fell back a bit, but they dominated the Balkans for quite a long period of time, including this city, this port city, Thessaloniki, which was renamed Salonica by the Ladino Jews, Ladino-speaking Jews who were there, and also by the Ottoman Turks. So they conquered this city in 1430, and they ruled there until 1912, so almost 500 years of Ottoman rule in a city that's well outside of Turkey. And so the Ottomans were always a minority ruling in this city that was a diverse city, but as we'll see, diverse in a few clear directions. That's how the Sephardic Jews got there, is because the Ottoman Empire was in charge. After the Jews were expelled from Spain in 1492 and in 1497 were forced to leave Portugal on the pain of mandatory conversion, the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire was happy to invite them in. It's the reason why it was so easy for them to get into all these places. And the famous phrase he used was, "I thank the King of Spain who has impoverished his empire and enriched mine at the same time, by sending me all these people with their languages and contacts and business acumen and ability and knowledge and wisdom." He was thrilled to get their contributions. Now, Thessaloniki was a major port city. It was also a major point of contact between Christian Europe and the Muslim Ottoman Empire, because you could get there from the Balkans by land, you could get there by sea through the Mediterranean, and it's, again, very close to that borderline between Europe and Asia that made Constantinople such a major nexus city of cultural and economic interchange. Now, when the Sephardic Jews began arriving after 1492, there were already Romaniot Jews there, that old Greek-speaking Jewish community that had been there dating back to the time of Hellenistic Jews. And over time, a new group would emerge there as well, which came out of the Sephardic Jewish community, but actually were intentionally converting to Islam and keeping a secret Jewish practice. There was a mystical messiah named Shabtai Zvi who actually was active in Salonika for a period of time in the middle of the 17th century. His story came to a peak in 1666, where his followers were excited that he was the Messiah. He was going to establish a new independent kingdom in Israel. He was taken and arrested in Constantinople, at this time now called Istanbul, and he was given a choice. They said, "You can convert to Islam or we'll kill you." Now, Jews have had messiahs die before. That actually worked out pretty well for the Christian followers. But in this case, Shabtai Zvi converted to Islam. Most of his followers had to admit, we messed up here. He must not have been the Messiah if he converted to another religion. But some of his followers actually saw him as a model, and they converted to Islam, but maintained a kind of secret Jewish practice. They were sometimes called from the outside the Donmeh, which means community, but they called themselves the Ma'amin, the believers. And they were Ladino speaking, but practicing Islam, sort of an odd conjunction of the identities. Again, they were a relatively small community compared to the vast majority of Sephardi-normative Salonika. We talked about Ashkenormative. This is Sephardi-normative, where there were so many Sephardic Jews, they overwhelmed even the Ashkenazi Jews that managed to find their way into Salonika. So let's talk about the demographics of this community. So here we have a couple of different ways to represent this. One graphically and one numerically. Here we go. Get what I wanted to do here. All right. So you have on the left, upper left, the population demonstrated visually from 1500 going forward. You'll see the total population is the top level. The blue are the number of Greeks, the green are the number of Turks, and the, say, light red are the number of Jews. And you'll see at certain points, for example, in the middle of the 1700s, the Jewish population point peaks, and they're certainly larger than either of the other two groups. In fact, they might be larger than the other two groups put together. And the population dips a bit around 1800, it continues to grow until around 1900, which is the peak of all three of those for a period of time. Again, notice the Jewish population proportionally is a large part of the city's population. And then the divergence takes place. We'll talk about why this happens shortly after 1900, beginning in 1920, where the Muslim population drops down to 0, the Greek population explodes, and the Jewish population initially gradually declines and then radically declines during World War II. And we'll unfortunately hear about that as well. Here you have it in a chart form where the Muslim Turkish population at the Turkish census of 1478 was about 4,300, and the Greek Orthodox was about 6,000. By 1500, it was about 8,500 to 8,000, so about on par between Turks and Greeks. But notice the Jewish population in just those short years has grown from 0 to 3,800 individuals. And it may be that one of the reasons the Turks invited the Jews in was to change the balance of demographics in the city. Notice that by 1890, after a few hundred years, the Jews represent 47% of the city, almost a majority. But they're certainly the largest group compared to the Greek Orthodox at 14% or the Muslim Turkish population at about 22%. And there were other miscellaneous groups like the Bulgars and the Roma people. So Jews were the dominant population force from early on all the way through the dawn of the 20th century. Look at 1913, where you have an increase in both populations, of course, but the Jews are still the largest single group. Not quite 47%, but still a dominant population. And then in 1920, the numbers begin to change after the War of Greek Independence, which takes place just before World War I in the Balkan Wars of 1912, 1913. You see that there's a change in the Turkish population, it goes down, the Greek population goes up, but the Jewish population still is going strong. And there is no one group that is a majority of the community. The major change that takes place happens between 1920 and 1928. The reason for that is we'll talk about in a little bit when we get to the major changes that took place in Salonica's history. Now, during these periods of time, when you have these large different population groups, they lived side by side, but they largely had a limited interaction. They might do business together occasionally, but there was, for all intents and purposes, no intermarriage between the communities. And if there was, you had to convert from one to the other. In the Muslim religious governance system, often called the millet system, you had your religious affiliation, and you could do everything you needed to do about your personal status with your religious authorities, which was progressive at the time. It was tolerant for Jews not to have to go to an imam, or for Christians to not to have to go to an imam for religious purposes of a marriage or a burial. They could go to their religious authorities, which were recognized by the government. But that meant, of course, you could not cross the boundaries. You couldn't have a Greek Orthodox person marrying a Muslim person. And the Muslims did still maintain the power of the death penalty for violating their norms. They were the police power. And so even if there was a kind of tolerance among the groups, there was still one group that was more equal than all the others, along the lines of the Pact of Umar that we saw in the first half of our class. So there was no intermarriage without conversion. If you wanted to intermarry, you had to convert to one or the other. And there was a commercial interchange, but not a social interchange because of dietary laws and customary norms. It was a kind of tolerance without multiculturalism. As I described at an earlier session, a plurality without pluralism, where you might have events where you bring together people, but they're living side by side, not really having a fruitful ideological interchange or a fusion cuisine kind of merging interaction between them. So to give you a couple of examples of how deeply rooted they were, but also some of the challenges that were presented by this, I want to read to you a couple of anecdotes. These come from a wonderful book called Salonica, City of Ghosts by Mark Mazower, Mazower. If you want to read more about Salonica, this is a great place to start. He does a wonderful job of setting the scene and painting the picture of Salonica broadly, as well as the Jewish specific experience. So here's a story that took place. This is in the middle part of the 19th century. There was a brawl between Jews and some others that winds up in an anti-Semitic accusation. The Archbishop announced that he would excommunicate any Christian who attended the annual soiree given by the Alatinis, the leading Jewish family in the city. But notice in that anecdote, there was an annual soiree that the leading Jewish family in the city offered that everybody attended. So there were some crossing of boundaries, occasionally for special events. Even the blood libel entered the scene when a respectable Greek surgeon saw a suspicious huddle of Jews around an Albanian man and reported to the police that some Jews were planning to seize a Christian to murder him for his blood. The police arrested all concerned and brought them before the Pasha, where it was discovered that the explanation was quite different. "What am I arrested for?" the Albanian exclaimed. "I have nothing to fear from the Jews, for I gain my bread by lighting the fires for these people on a Saturday." They wouldn't have used the phrase Shabbos Goy, which is a Yiddish inflected phrase, but he was the non-Jew who lit the fires for them on Saturdays, which they wouldn't light for themselves. So he was just doing business with them. I mean, another example of the parallel lives they lived was the fact that there was no time in common. They didn't have public spaces like squares or boulevards. They were dark and deserted at nights. There were no street names or numbers. The first detailed map from Salonica dates from 1882, and time didn't work, and the call to prayer didn't help that much either. There were few public clock towers, and there were 3 calendars in use, 4 if you counted the Jewish calendars. You had the Greek Orthodox calendar, the Muslim religious calendar, and the Ottoman imperial calendar. When you asked the time, you had to specify, did you mean the time alla turca, which began at dawn, or the time alla franca, which is the European style of keeping time? Travelers were thrown by being asked, "At what time is noon today?" And to add to the sense of disorientation, signs and shop placards could be written in one of 4 scripts, and conversations overheard in more than half a dozen languages, or an amalgam of them all. So you could have a sign in Ladino, a sign in Arabic, a sign in the Romanized Ottoman alphabet, or in Greek, or in Latin letters. So it was almost impossible to have fruitful interchange between the groups. And at times, the Jewish experience of being the majority, or at least being the dominant group in the city, led to bad behavior. Greco-Jewish relations were infused with tension, writes Mazower. And he points out, for the Greeks, it could not have been easy living as a minority in the city they regarded as their own. Jewish children laughed at the Orthodox priests with their long hair tied up in a bun. Estaban papas became a way of saying it was time to visit the barber. They would make fun of each other, saying, "You look like a priest. Go get a haircut." Of course, in Ladino, estaban papas. But they were mocking the priesthood. Or another example, there was a court case in the year 1700. The Greek inhabitants of a particular neighborhood were so fed up with their Jewish neighbors throwing their garbage into the churchyard and mocking them from surrounding windows during holiday services, they appealed to the Ottoman authorities to get them to stop. So in a place where the Jews had the power, they were making fun of the other people's religious authorities and throwing their garbage into the church courtyards instead of what we think of as anti-Semitic or anti-Jewish persecution. But also consider the tremendous power the Jews had over the city. As I mentioned, the port on Salonica was closed on Shabbat. So all the porters and warehouse people could have their day of rest. And the power of rabbinic authority was consequently very strong. There was an episode in 1732 where 2 Italian Jews got into a dispute with a native Salonican Jew named Jacob Capon, who was the Pasha's banker and treasurer, a very important Jew in the town. And so he prevailed upon his friend, the rabbi of the town, who excommunicated the Italian Jews. Well, why is that a problem? None of the dock workers would touch their stuff because they didn't want to risk excommunication either. And in the end, they had to resolve it with Jacob because they couldn't get around it. Now, as time went on and Western colonial and cultural influences begin to have a stronger voice in the Salonican Jewish community, you also begin to see a weakening of this religious authority. So as one example, after many years of resistance, in 1873, one of those Alliance Israélite Universelle schools was opened. I mentioned, these European influenced schools that are teaching kids science and math and French and European languages and modern history and modern agricultural techniques and accounting. Wonderful business skills, but also that mentality of a modern European orientation that might be anathema to a traditional religious authority. The initial rabbi was opposed to them doing it when they first started to open in 1873. Later rabbi was more accommodationist, worked out a compromise, such that 50 years later, by the 1920s, half of Salonica's Jewish kids went to the Alliance Israélite Universelle schools, 4,000 kids going to these modernizing, Europeanizing, liberalizing schools, because they saw the commercial and personal advantage to doing so, to having that European literacy. And after all, if you're already speaking Ladino, learning French is not that far a jump. What you also see beginning in the 1920s and 30s is a flourishing of all the elements of Jewish modernity. You have a pro-Zionist movement. You have a pro-communist movement. You have a Jewish labor movement based in Salonika, organizing in Ladino, including organizing boycotts. You have Ladino language and Judesmo, popular sort of street language, secular theater, like the Yiddish theater, secular newspapers. You even have in 1928, the founding of the Association of Jewish Assimilationists, whose goal was to create and develop among Salonika Jews feelings utterly identical with those of their fellow citizens, regardless of religious persuasion, without distancing themselves from the Jewish faith, the Jewish tradition, and the spirit of Jewish solidarity. In other words, be more like the Greeks around us in 1928 and not so separate and not so different. Just like you had Reform Jews and integrationist, assimilationist Jews in Western Europe as well. In many ways, Salonika was a Europeanized city, even though it had lived in the Ottoman Empire for so many centuries. Now, there were three major events that ultimately underlined and undermined the Jewish community of Salonika. The first took place in 1917, and that was the Great Fire of Salonika. In 1917, there was a fire struck by a cooking fire that wasn't maintained. And by the way, there had been periodic fires from time to time. Ottoman cities were not known for their wide boulevards or their easy firefighting techniques, and the technology was very old there. There was also an episode described in the book where there was a fire, but because the local fire engine was a Christian fire engine, they wouldn't help out the Muslims put out the fire. It shows you how split these communities were in their different ideologies and identities. So in this setting, the old city center is caught on fire. It's very densely packed. It's accumulated centuries of dirt and debris. Ultimately, 3/4 of the old city center is destroyed. If you do go to visit Thessaloniki, by the way, there are still elements of the old Ottoman town, but it's what was on the hillside. And what was saved from the fire, the vast majority of it was wiped out in that fire of 1917. There were some 72,000 people who wound up homeless, and 50,000 of them were Jews, because again, the Jews had lived in the slums. They were the laboring class of the city, not just the elites in the suburbs here. And the city was rebuilt in 1917. Remember, the Balkan War has passed, the Greeks are now in charge, and they rebuild the city on a European model. And the Jews are forced to move elsewhere. Some of them live in transit camps for a while and don't get permanent housing. This also leads to the beginning of a Sephardic Jewish emigration. Once the Muslims had left and the Greeks came in and were not always as nice to the Jews as the Ottoman Turks had been, some Sephardic Jews from Salonika began to leave. They might have landed in Israel. They might have moved to Spanish-speaking territories, or even to North America. There's in fact a substantial Ladino background Sephardic community in the Pacific Northwest. And you can find some synagogues by that orientation and with that linguistic tradition there that come out of this background, some of them coming from Salonika, in fact. But it was also a sign of judgment of the time. There was a famous Judeo-Spanish Song of the Fire, which blamed the catastrophe of 1917 to los pecados de Shabbat, the sins of Shabbat, the fact that the Jews weren't observing it. But by the 1920s, because modernization had accelerated, they changed the lyrics. And so now God punished the city because los muchachas de agora todas vistan de tango. All the young girls of today are dressing up for the tango. They're dressing immodestly, and that's why the fire came. But this fire was a radical disaster, destruction of Jewish property and homes, and an instability of Jewish population. And the fact that it was not rebuilt to rehouse the original inhabitants showed that things had changed. Remember that shift in 1928 that showed how many more Greeks were there than Jews? Well, we'll see that again in just a moment. And part of it is a reflection of the change in power dynamics. Notice as well, the second major factor was the Greek defeat in the Greco-Turkish War after World War I. The Greeks were excited by the fall of the Ottoman Empire, and they invade Turkey, in fact, in 1919 and 1920. They are ultimately kicked out by Kemal Atatürk, who rallies the Turkish forces and becomes the dictator of the new the modern Turkey, and an interesting secularizer in his own right. But the end result of this war between Greece and Turkey is an agreement for a population exchange. And what winds up happening is 1.2 million Greeks leave Asia Minor, those cities along the coast, like Izmir and some others, and 355,000 Muslims leave the Balkans and Greek territory, Macedonia, and other places. So you have this massive population exchange of 1.2 million Greeks, ethnic Greeks, religious Greeks coming from Asia Minor, and 355,000 Turks and Muslims leaving the Balkans and moving. Now, some stayed in the Balkans. Think of the Bosnian Muslims or the Croatian Muslims. They stayed, but many of the Turks wound up leaving. And that includes several thousand leaving from Salonika proper. In fact, the exchange in Salonika was about 20,000 Turks leaving and about 100,000 ethnic Greek refugees coming into Thessaloniki, as it's now called, because now that it's under Greek territory, it's not Salonika, it becomes Thessaloniki. After that Greek reconquest in 1912, that had begun the process of Hellenization. And again, I'll share the numbers here. Notice in 1920, you still have some of those Turks living there, 25,000, even after the shift of power from the Ottoman Empire. But by 1928, that number is down to 0. And you notice the Greek population has more than doubled from 77,000 to 196,000 in 8 short years. Notice the Jewish population has also gone down, whether it's the refugees from that fire and the homelessness that they experienced, or the attraction of other territories, or the persecution of the intense Hellenization process to which they were submitted by the new Greek authorities. Sephardic Jews began to leave. Many stayed, but a number of them did choose to leave. The Greek reconquest in 1912 had begun that process of Hellenization, where they had mandatory Greek lessons, had to learn about Greek culture, had to be loyal citizens of the new Greek monarchy. But by and large, that was workable. You could bring a Greek teacher into an Alliance Israelite school. It wouldn't be too much of a problem. There was still some lingering suspicion of the Jews as Ottoman allies. And we also know the Eastern Orthodox Church has a strong anti-Jewish flavor in it, sometimes even more so than the Catholic Church, if you can believe that, depending on the territory. And so that didn't help either. But the Jews were now a minority, right? You had 190,000 Greeks and 45,000 Jews. They're still a substantial population, but they're now a much smaller minority when before they were the plurality. They were the largest single group. And that changes the dynamics as well. Ironically, the requirement to learn Greek was helpful to younger Jews in the next 20 years, because when the Holocaust happens and Jews try to hide as non-Jews, the younger Jews who are fluent in Greek are able to do it because they don't have an accent. But the older Jews who learned Greek later speak their Greek with a Ladino accent because they didn't need to learn Greek. They had Greek neighbors all those centuries, but they never bothered to learn it because they didn't need to. They spoke Ladino, and it made it harder to hide during that Holocaust period. Ultimately, the Jewish population winds up around 50,000 before World War II, and that is really the third disaster of Jewish Salonika. About 45,000 Jews ultimately are deported to Auschwitz in 1943, and only about 4%, maybe 1,600 of them, managed to survive. Today, there's about 1,000 Jews left in Salonika. It's a shadow of what it once was. And in many ways, the story of Jewish Salonika and its tragedy at the end is dramatized by the story of the Jewish cemetery of Salonika. Now, the Jewish cemetery in Salonika dated back several hundred years. It could have been a treasure trove of genealogies and historical information, and it was huge. It was just outside of the city walls of the old city. Remember the old city that burned down? The cemetery was outside those old city walls. Well, as the population is growing, particularly with the Hellenization of the city after the conquest from the Ottomans, there's a real pressure to expand the city. But they couldn't expand in that direction because it was covered up by a cemetery. And to give you an idea of how big this cemetery was, the Jewish cemetery of Prague, which is celebrated as a very historic cemetery in Prague, Czech Republic these days, was 1 hectare large. The Jewish cemetery in Salonika was 35 hectares. It was 35 times the size of the Jewish cemetery of Prague. But in 1943, as part of the Jewish dispossession happening under the Nazis, the Greek authorities asked the Nazis to help them get possession of the Jewish cemetery, which in the end takes place in a radically fast way. All those marble headstones become very popular paving material, or lining of swimming pools, or even repurposing for other cemetery use. Scrape it down, remove the inscription, put on a new one. And so the territory was vacant without the Jews there after they were deported to Auschwitz, and some of them came back but could not reclaim it. And after World War II, the city fathers decreed that this territory, having been abandoned, would now become the University of Thessaloniki. And so today, if you go to Thessaloniki and you visit the university, you are actually stepping in many parts on what used to be the Jewish cemetery of Salonika. And at the time of Meiserwer's book, when he wrote it, maybe 15 years ago, there wasn't even a plaque there that indicated what used to be there. And the only memorial to the Jews of Salonika and their death in the Holocaust was a very small monument on the way to the airport. There was a museum of Jewish Thessaloniki and Jewish Salonika that the Jews themselves put together, but the city itself had a love-hate relationship with its Ottoman past, because after all, that was a sign of Greek weakness, that they weren't able to reconquer the city for so many centuries. And today, Thessaloniki is Greece's second largest city. There's well over 1 million inhabitants, and the Jews represent 0.25%. So from 47% to 0.25%, that's the Jews of Thessaloniki today. Now, there are many legacies of the Sephardic Jewish experience that are still popular in Jewish life today, and some are getting reclaimed. You may have heard of eating sufganiot, jelly donuts for Hanukkah. That's a popular piece. Some communities use a song called Ocho Candelicas, which is a Ladino song, a very fun song. It was actually written more recently. We heard from Flori Jagoda, who is a famous Ladino language folk singer, who herself was born in Bosnia, escaped at age 16 from the Nazis and managed to survive the war. And she wrote the song Ocho Candelicas in 1983 to create new Ladino culture as a way of showing that we're still here, we're still alive, and we're still being creative. Even today, many communities use Ocho Candelicas as a staple Hanukkah song. And I'll play for you one more. It's a song written, I think, in recent years by a new Ladino composer named Sarah Aroeste. It's a song called Añada Buena that my community actually introduced to its repertoire for the high holidays in recent years because it's such a beautiful song. It works both in Ladino and in English, and they have the lyrics on the screen as well. So here you have Añada Buena. As we did last time, if you have any comments or questions or other topics to branch into it in our last 15 minutes, you can start putting them in the chat or in the Q&A as we hear the video. And again, a very creative artist and humanist appropriate too. So why not? One of the questions I got was at the end of the previous session was, what are the secular and humanistic aspects of these communities? And the answer is it's sometimes complicated. You know, the Mizrahi world tended to be rather religious oriented, and the Sephardic world had a very established root in traditional Jewish practice and observance. But you know, when you get this kind of cultural linguistic identity, that opens up the possibility for a secularization, just like many of the early secular Jews were part of the Jewish labor movement or focused on Yiddish language and connected to Yiddish culture through theater and through new poetry and newspapers, the same kind of things that was same kind of phenomena that were taking place in Salonica and in the Ladino diaspora more broadly. So that opens up the possibility for a cultural secular identity. So there may well have been secular Ladino-speaking Jews, even if the establishment of the community was more religiously oriented. But again, that's no reason for us to not explore using elements of this tradition in what we do in a secular or humanistic Jewish community, simply because it's part of the wide range and rainbow of Jewish cultural opportunities. You know, as long as we provide acknowledgement and acceptance of that, I think it can be a very meaningful enriching of our cultural resources and library. You know, in some ways, while you're still thinking, I'll keep talking, so it makes it harder for you to think. The example of the Jews of Salonika is instructive and problematic. You know, it's problematic in the fact that when they had the power of the majority and political authority, they sometimes abused it and abused the minorities. So maybe it wasn't, you know, maybe power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely applies even to Jews who in positions of authority can undermine that dynamic. Also, you have that, again, that concept of plurality without pluralism, where you could live side by side, but not necessarily interact and have interchange as we would think of a pluralistic ideology. On the other hand, having that sort of the non-ghetto walls that you carry with you does enable survival as the non-majority for a long period of time. You know, those Jews of Salonika were 30, 40, 50% of the population, even at their peak, but they make it, you know, because they are able to maintain their distinct identity even with outside pressures and even into the 20th century. In the chat, somebody mentions there is a Jew of Salonika that is surviving in Auschwitz even in 1944 and into 45 when Primo Levi is there, and he actually stays in January 1945 when they evacuate the camp, where Elie Wiesel, who was there at the same time, participates in the death march that takes place. But yes, there is a couple Jews of Salonika that make an appearance in Levi's book Survival in Auschwitz, which originally in Italian was If This Be a Man. For whatever reason, they changed the title into English. Other thoughts or comments on the Jews of Salonika? As I said, you know, for a Sunday school or for a community where students are much more exposed to Spanish than they are to German, Ladino can be an easy access point where it's easier for them to understand what's going on. It can also be an interesting challenge to give them a piece of a Ladino text and see if they can read it. If they're in a Hebrew school and they're learning Hebrew, in theory, they should be able to read Ladino once you tell them that the ah is an ah sound and the vav is an o sound. They should be able to decipher it, but it's hard going because when you're used to reading Hebrew with the vowels and now you're reading it like Yiddish or like Ladino, it can be a bit of a stretch. But then you see the word bueno. Oh, bueno. And then you know what it is. And you could see even in the examples of the Ladino songs that we played in Cuando el Rey Nimrod or in Serra Aroeste's Añada Buena, you can recognize words in there if you know Spanish, because it's medieval Spanish and many of them translate, even if some of the vocabulary is slightly different. If you look up Ocho Candelicas, for example, some of the numbers are slightly different, but you can explore that on your own and see that example of Ladino song making even in the 1980s and extended backwards as well.